Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Economics, and today is lesson 6 and it's titled Classical Theories of Economic Growth and Development. This discussion is solely meant for developing countries. Let me emphasize the point. This studies is solely meant for developing economies. My name is H. Kwame Afaglo. All right. We've had other discussions and they're on YouTube. You could just follow up and then you continue in that lesson. When it comes to classical theories of economic development, classical or classic itself means old. And so we'll get to the new, which will be new classical, and then maybe contemporary. And when this happens, why do we have to study the old? It's not like it's just like history, but this is one bit of history of economics or economic development, development economics. The essence is that if we do not study this trend, the past to the present may make a future, will make an error. The present will make an error into the future by repeating the mistakes of the past if they do not know. All right, let me put it this way. We're studying this because if the present do not know what has happened in the past, they may repeat the mistake of the past into the future. Then it means that we're going reverse wars when it comes to development or economic growth. All right, so we go straight into action and then we say economic growth and development actually didn't start today, but will pin ours from the Second World War. Post-Second World War rather, we pin ours from post-Second World War. Post-Second World War, immediately after Second World War was over, 45, 46 thereabout, there was the Marshall Plan. That's US funded a lot of the development. Huge money funds was given to European countries to develop their ravaged economies. Brilliant. That's the Marshall Plan. So then what's the import here? The import here is that based on that, Europeans and Americans decided that if they had a plan for Europe to move from its ravaged economy into a great economy or an advanced economy, then it's possible that for those of us in the traditional economies like Africa, Latin America, and some parts of Asia, they could fund us that way and move us out of our misery or move us out of poverty. And that is what they think and they call modernization. So there are 4 models in the classical theories. One of them is a model, means there's something miniature that will represent the whole, meaning that it's a model. And these are theories. So there are 4 of them. One is the linear stage of growth model. The second one is theories of patterns and structural change. The third one is international dependence revolution. And the fourth one is neoclassical counter-revolution. All right. So let's start with the first 2. Today, learners would appreciate what we call the linear stage of growth. Then they will also appreciate the theories and patterns of structural change. The next session will take care of international dependence revolution and then neoclassical counter-revolution. So then let's go into looking at it. Linear stage growth. When we talk of linear stage growth, this belongs to the 1950s and 60s, where the scholars at the time leaned onto Walt Rosto's perception that, look, his proposal rather, Walt Rostow proposed that if traditional economies want to become a developed economy, want to grow their economy, they have to go through the stepwise approach, the stage-wise, and they don't jump any stage. It must be linear, it must be straightforward, and it must be one after the other. Okay, so that's why it's called linear, meaning that savings and investment would give economic growth. That's what Rostow says, and that was accepted at the time in 1950s. And he says that it must be methodical. It must not, you don't jump it. There's nothing to change about it. You have to go through it, and so that's why it's called linear. So you see on the screen we have savings and investment and growth. That's economic growth. All right, that was picked up. The same linear stage economic growth or model was picked up by Harrod and Doman. Harrod and Doman theory went in further to put up a certain formula to it. When they say, okay, when you say economic growth, that is GDP, gross domestic product. So any change in GDP must be dependent on the formula we call savings growth, S upper script G, divided by capital output ratio minus depreciation. Okay, savings growth, savings is savings and investment. That one we all can understand it. If you save, you are likely to have something for the future. Okay, so if you have excess and then you store some, that is savings. All right, but then capital ratio, capital output ratio is the investment, the capital that you put into a factory that produces the same unit or more units. That is what we call the capital output ratio. So if you divide the savings by the capital output ratio minus depreciation, you have gross domestic product change, a change in GDP. And so simply put, GDP is equal to a savings growth divided by capital output ratio minus depreciation. All right, granted, on the screen you see, granted a very simplistic formula that there is a savings, a country makes a savings of say 5% for a year, and its capital output ratio is 2.5. It presupposes that the GDP growth will be what? 2.5%, because 5 divided by 2.5 is 2.5%. All right. What if you want to move your growth faster in the subsequent years as a developing economy? You are likely to what? Increase your taxes, group in more taxes, aggressively collect taxes, and move the taxes and maybe foreign aid from 5% to maybe 15%. Then you divide by 2.5. When you do that, you are likely to get 6% of GDP change, and that is a very fast growth. Normally, when it comes to growth in GDP, developing economies grow faster than the developed economies when it comes to such GDP growth rates. So economic growth rates are normally higher for developing economies than developed economies. So that being the case, it does not mean that the developing country has equated the developed economy. No, that does not mean that. Businesses, based on that, this Rostow and then Harrod and Doman formula, developed economies decided to what? Invest in developing economies, Africa, Latin America, and some part of Asia. How do they do it? See, change in GDP is equal to SG superscript G divided by C. So they decide to use the C, which is the capital output ratio. If they increase the capital output ratio, they put in a lot of factories and businesses. The capital output ratio multiplied by the GDP will give us what? A bigger savings. And then that's what it is they did. If you look at the formula, it's going to be the denominator crossover to GDP. So GDP times capital output ratio will give you higher savings growth. And that's what they did. So they put in factories and all that into Africa, especially South America, especially South Korea, and then Japan. Japan was rubbish too at the time, so they put in a lot of capital investment in those areas, and they moved their savings faster, and so you find their economies are bigger. They sent in what we call technology, and the moment you make mention of technology and technology transfer, it's a capital investment. It's an investment. So that's what they did. So they multiplied the C, they increased the C in those countries and multiplied by GDP and got the higher savings rate. So it means the formula works. But does it work every time? And that's what we are not too sure of, in the sense that it does not take care of consumption. The formula does not take care of consumption, right? And once it doesn't take care of consumption, it becomes problematic. It doesn't take care of other expenditure apart from depreciation that it talks. And the depreciation is about the wares, the machinery wear. So let's take a break and then we continue on the structural change model. By the way, before we take this break, another weakness of the linear is that it's just linear. You have to follow it stepwise, so there's no way to jump. However, you could jump because it's not always about factories, it's also about services. And then what they call modernization, to change traditional economies to modern economy, is Western technology and Western values. Does that mean that Western technologies and Western values are mandatory for all of us to adapt before we become modernized? Those are questions that you have to ask. Are we not living, or are they not also living? Who says that you need to have factories before you call it work? What about others who were doing subsistence farming? Were they hungry? Are we more hungry now? Are there more slums in developing economies now in 2023 than in 1950s and 60s? Today's date is the 8th of December 2023. Those are the questions we're going to ask. So let's take our break and back. Okay, welcome back again to this session, and we're talking about what linear stage model. The emphasis was placed on savings and investment for economic growth. And then now the question is this, that how come Marshall Plan worked in Europe but it's not working in developing economies? It's not working partially because there were facilities that were not in developing economies. Say our transportation network and transportation facilities were not up to scratch in developing economies. So even if you put in a lot of money, it won't work. So then you would have to sort out the transportation, a layout for water, layout for toilets, layout for... There were none of these things in developing economies. So all these things have to be done. All this infrastructure development needed to be done. And because they were not done, it became a weakness for developing economies. And so the Marshall Plan that was adapted from Europe into Africa and Latin America and then some part of Asia did not just work. And because it didn't work, another model will have to come out. Another model was looked at quickly. Development economists and economists generally had to look at other models. Scholars would have to look at other models. Intellectuals would have to look at other models. And the model that was looked at, the next model was the structural change model. The structural change model actually focused on how do we transform agrarian economies to industrialized economies. That was the focus. Agrarian economies to industrial economies. Here there are two thoughts. Here. One thought was by the Lewis theory, or by Lewis, and so it's called the Lewis theory. That's what we call the two-sector surplus labor model. The two-sector surplus labor model. And then the other is patterns and development model, which is an empirical analysis by Chinnery. I think it's Hollis Chinnery and his group and his team. All right, so let's take it one after the other. When it comes to the two-sector surplus labor model, Lewis model, which is otherwise called Lewis model or Lewis theory of development, economic development. The Lewis theory of economic development, here what Lewis projects or proposes is that we have two sectors. That's the rural subsistence farming economy, and then we have the urban mechanized or urban industrialized economy. So there are two sectors. And then labor, surplus labor, he says that there's so much surplus labor in the rural subsistence farming communities, surplus and cheap, that if you transfer to the urban mechanized or urban industrialized sector, there will be no effect, that you all benefit, because there will not be shortage in the rural subsistence farming economy. Neither will there be shortage. There will be surplus to all over the place. So there's nothing to worry. So he says labor is cheap, and then cheap and in abundance. Based on that, he proposed that because labor is cheap and abundance, the focus must just be on savings and investment. Then capital, savings, investment, and capital. Okay, so then if the industrialized countries get into Africa, Asia, they should just get this labor cheap and then just take them into work, into the factories. It did work. It did work for China and India. See, what we mean by that is that if, say, you hire, example, 1,000 labor, 1 unit of labor will come at a price, but any amount of labor, any number rather of labor after 1,000 is the same amount you pay. The unit wage of a laborer is what? Maybe 20 cents. But if you want more than 1,000, you just pay $1,000. Anything 10,000, 20,000 laborers, you still pay $1,000. So that is where his proposals comes from. So he says labor is so cheap. It means that labor, when it plateaus, it becomes elastic. It just goes straight. The price that you pay, the wage you pay for labor after 1,000, whether it's 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 laborers you use in your factories, is the same amount. So you might as well order more and make the margin See, you order more labor, use them, and then make more profit from the margin. Based on that, he came up with this curve, as we see. The curve as we see it is just as it is, the elastic, labor being elastic, and then see it plateaus. When you look at this, on the horizontal is the number of labor, and then on the vertical is what we call the total production for food. So if that be the case, where it plateaus, it just goes straight. Okay, if you look at the LO, that's the labor at this peak, where you pay at this peak. When you transfer it straight on that same line to the second graph below, and then the quantity of labor and the total food production above, you find that the marginal labor, production labor, against the average production labor, the marginal production labor will hit and the horizontal axis, the x-axis, that is 0. Meaning that if it hits that, the marginal is the marginal. Marginal is what? Any unit after the peak is marginal. Okay, so then when you subtract on the wage you pay is the W when it is average, but when it's marginal is 0. So then between 0 and W is all profit for the entrepreneur, the capitalist, and so they make all that as profit. That is his assumption, and it works. In China, it worked all the way until 2010 when changes happen. Okay, so when you come to the industries, you see in the industry, you see two curves. You see two curves that way. You see three curves rather. And its production in the industries, you pay by the unit of laborers that you want. So if you want higher production, you employ more labor and you pay more, just as it is TP1, TP2, TP3. Then when you take that same curve, you just, when it comes to its labor, when labor comes to wages payment, it will then, the curve will then come down. See, the more you pay, the more labor you get, and the productivity would give you a certain margin. There's a marginal return, so it will definitely have to come down. The higher the number of laborers you take, the lower the productivity, and then the lower the productivity is likely to be the lower the wage, because you start making returns on the higher numbers. That's some economies of scale for labor costs. So then it's D3, D2, D1. When you put the elastic labor point curve, the elastic labor, the linear elastic labor on the horizontal, that is the SS as you see, you find out that no, you make more profit, and that profit is what Lewis is saying that they make. And so capitalists making all that profit, does that mean that that's the best way? I'm not too sure. Is it realistic? Yes, to some extent, in the sense that in China they had so much labor, capitalists from the West went there, invested, and they had so much cheap labor that they invested so much, and China also invested in its own people and then just boosted the economy. China invested in their own people, using them as laborers, and then boosted the economic growth, and they have gotten the peak of it. And that peak, it was only up until 2010, the year 2010, that laborers decided to ask for wage increments, and that is where the Lewis curve ends. Okay, before it ends, it is self-sustaining, that once you put it in motion, with no matter the number of laborers you employ from developing countries, moving them from subsistence farming to urban industrialized towns, the rate is the same. It's cheap labor. So then it means that you can make more profit. That's self-sustenance economy. It keeps rolling for a long time. You start making profits for a long time once you run on that. However, if it plateaus to a point where the farmers, subsistence farmers, are not having enough laborers, and so they will have to employ more, that means that their produce, the price of their produce will go up. Once the price of their produce goes up, it will definitely affect the price of food. And once it affects the price of food, those in the urban factories would have to buy food at a higher price. They'll ask for what? Wage increment, and that is inflation, food inflation. Then farmers will also increase the price for their food produce, and then you enter the spiral cyclic inflation. Okay, that is just one aspect of it. The other weakness is that labor is not as cheap as he says, as Lewis thinks, because labor has a value. Labor has a value, and that is the wages they pay. And once you are paying wages, there comes a point where people want salary increment. You have to progress them with experience, not necessarily just the wholesome trade unionist kind of increase, but incremental jumps as the year comes to an end. That also affects labor costs. The other bit is that the profits is assumed to be plowed back into the industry, but it doesn't really happen. Capitalists, once you have higher profits, the GDP, see the S over C, the C is so high that when you multiply by GDP to send the savings growth higher, the formula we looked at to send the savings growth higher from the Lewis model, the Harrod-Dumar model. Okay, if that be the case, you plow back your profits, but they don't plow back the profit because they would have to repatriate all that profit. So the GDP is said to be very high of those economies, but the reality is that there's capital flight. All that profits have been taken out of those developing countries to the developed world. Ghana has 100% repatriation of profit out of the country, and that itself is a weakness for a country like Ghana to know that they would have to relook at that repatriation, percentage repatriation out of funds out of the country. Okay, so that's it. On that bit, you now look at it. Let's take a commercial break, please. All right, welcome back. I was looking at the weaknesses of the two-sectoral surplus labor model by Lewis, the Lewis theory. We were saying that the Lewis theory, the entrepreneurs or the capitalists from the West, they repatriate all their profits. Once they repatriate their profit, before they repatriate their profit, the GDP looks very high of these countries. But once they repatriate their profits, there's no cash actually in that economy for what? Social development, infrastructure development, which are already lacking. The funds have been taken out as capital flight, and that makes the Lewis model a weakness, a big-time weakness. All right, let's go to the other model, which is the Chinnery and his team's model, which is the pattern of development model under the same structural change. Here, the focus is not on savings and investments as growth, economic growth, but he's saying that, look, if you want to look at it, they are saying that if you want to look at economic growth, you have to do a time series. You have to take a long time to study what changes are happening in the developing economies on various factors. Okay, under the patterns and development theories, an empirical analysis where Chinnery and Hollis did work. These were all events that were taking place in the 1950s and 60s because there were various views which were not working, which was not working. Various views were not working actually. That of the linear stage model wasn't working. So then we moved to the Lewis model. Lewis model worked and it became recessive. Then now the Chinnery model, that's the patterns and development. They took a long time to study how traditional economies were expanding and growing, or the economies were growing to the extent that they seem to have moved away from the traditional practice, that the agrarian economies seem to have moved out of agrarian economy to an industrial economy. And those were the ways they used time series and then cross-sectional approach. With cross-sectional approach, so they have to look at various factors and not savings and investments. As Lewis theory states, they look at socioeconomic factors, they look at international trade, consumer behavior, they look at urbanization, distribution of the country's population, and various other factors like imports, the sources of capital, technology transfer, and the export markets. When they looked at all that, they said, no, look, that can be done if you want to transform an agrarian economy to an industrialized economy. When you look at the end results, it shows that, look, these changes have proven a point. That's what the Chinnery's work did over a long period of time. It's proven a lot of work. And if that be the case, we notice that they are measuring the end results without necessarily finding the cause. Okay, let me put it this way. The patterns of development theory, they look at the patterns of growth of the economy on various factors like socioeconomic, imports, exports, technology, capital transfers, population, natural resources of that country. They're looking at how endowed the country is in terms of resources, how they behave and all that. And they're looking at the international trade as well. When they measured all those, they realized that there is a certain pattern that people or economies can move away in the 50s and the 60s, can move from agrarian economy into industrialized economies, and they can then supply their goods to the West. That was ravished, and they needed more resources, so they were exporting most of the raw materials from developing economies into the Western economies, where they needed them for their growth. Apparently, they have a lot of funds from Washington, that's USA, and the Marshall Plan to develop. So then the developing countries became feeder countries. They became feeder countries and feeding the Western countries, the European countries. And that's how it was modeled on. That's the patterns of development. So they studied the patterns and they realized that they're looking at the end results. And the end results points to things like international trade and co. But then into the 70s, they realized there was so much slums, urban slums. See, there was gradually beginning to be surplus labor in the urban centers. People were not getting jobs, there was joblessness, and they came from urban migration from rural to urban in developing countries, and that became problematic in the 70s. So there were some upheavals in various countries. Those upheavals questioned the Chinre, the pattern and development theory, that you don't study the end without knowing the cause. And that's one of the weaknesses of the Chinre, or the patterns and development theory. You don't study the end without knowing the cause. So in all of them have been used, however, but into the 70s, a new model came. Let's pause here and then we continue another time into lesson 7. The name again is Kwame Afaglo. All your comments, please don't hesitate to post them on the email and the WhatsApp as shown above. Thank you.